January 1st, 1958. San Quentin State Prison, California. The mess hall has been cleared of its usual iron smell and replaced with something stranger: cigarette smoke, nervous laughter, and a stage. Johnny Cash walks out in black, holds a guitar like it might run away from him, and starts to play. 1,200 inmates are on their feet before the first verse ends. In the middle of that crowd, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed, is a 20-year-old kid from Oildale who is 13 months into a sentence of 2 to 15 years for attempted robbery. He watches Cash work that room, and something shifts behind his eyes. He doesn't know yet that this single concert will decide the next 60 years of his life. He doesn't know yet that the governor of California, a man named Ronald Reagan, who once called Haggard's music the voice of the forgotten American, will personally sign a pardon that gives him back everything a felony conviction takes away. And he doesn't know yet that the country music industry, which will sell hundreds of millions of his records, will spend the better part of 2 decades treating him like a man who should probably be grateful just to be allowed in the room. Most of what was still ahead of him was enormous. Some of it was ugly. A lot of it was both at the same time. Welcome to Country Mysteries. Merle Ronald Haggard was born on April 6, 1937, in a converted railroad boxcar on the outskirts of Oildale, California, a strip of Kern County so dusty and forgotten that locals describe it less as a town and more as a warning. His parents, James and Flossie Haggard, had driven that boxcar west from Chakotah, Oklahoma, as part of the Dust Bowl migration that John Steinbeck wrote about, and most of America preferred not to think about. James converted the car into a livable space himself, laying in plumbing and patching the walls. In my opinion, there's something almost mythologically on the nose about the fact that one of country music's most important voices literally started life inside a vehicle going nowhere. Oildale in the late 1930s and early 1940s was a hard place with few illusions. The refinery towers burned off gas into the night sky, the soil was cracked and alkaline, and the people who lived there were largely the ones America had decided it could do without. Merle's father worked in a machine shop and played fiddle on weekends, not professionally, but with the seriousness of a man who understood that music was one of the few things the Depression hadn't managed to repossess. Then in 1946, James Haggard died of a brain hemorrhage. Merle was 9 years old. The family received $63 from the railroad where James had briefly worked, which is to say they received very little and were expected to manage. Flossie took work at the cannery and kept the household together with a discipline that Merle would later describe as loving but absolute. That discipline, as it turned out, did not transfer to her son. "I think I just missed my dad so much that nothing could fill the hole," Haggard told journalist Jimmy McDonough in a 1999 Rolling Stone interview. "I started running before I knew what I was running from." He was expelled from school multiple times before the age of 14. He hopped freight trains, not as a romantic gesture, but because freight trains actually went somewhere. He was arrested for the first time at 14 for stealing a car he barely knew how to drive. By 16, he had run away from home so many times that Flossie eventually had him declared incorrigible and signed the paperwork to have him sent to a reform school in Whittier, California. The school, as reform schools in the 1950s often were, mostly reformed him in the direction of learning better methods. What nobody around him quite understood yet was that Merle Haggard had the kind of charisma that tends to go one of 2 directions. The tragedy was that nobody around him was positioned to point him toward the useful one. That reorientation would come later, from a much less likely source, in a much less likely place. Merle heard Lefty Frizzell on the radio in 1951, and that was essentially that. He was 13, sitting in the boxcar house that still smelled faintly of machine oil and old wood, and Frizzell's voice came through the speaker, doing things with a vowel that nobody had apparently told him were impossible. Merle saved up for a cheap guitar, taught himself the chords from a Mel Bay book, and by the time he was 15, he could reproduce Frizzell's phrasing closely enough to cause problems. The problems being, a teenage kid with a guitar and no particular reason to stay home is substantially harder to manage than a teenage kid without one. In 1951, Lefty Frizzell was arguably the most imitated vocalist in country radio. Haggard absorbed him the way a sponge absorbs water, enthusiastically and completely. "Lefty Frizzell changed my life," Haggard said in a 1973 interview with Country Music magazine. "There'll never be another singer like him, as far as the way he could caress a note." This from a man who would eventually caress a few notes of his own. Not much of a tribute if you let yourself think about it too hard. The guitar, and the reputation it built, would open one door specifically. Not a club door or a record label door. A prison door. And it would happen sooner than anyone expected. By 17, Merle was playing local honky-tonks around Bakersfield on weekends and running with people his mother accurately identified as trouble during the week. The Bakersfield sound, raw, electric, unapologetic, built by people who thought Nashville had gotten too soft, was still coalescing in these bars in the mid-1950s. Buck Owens hadn't broken through yet. Wynn Stewart was playing the Cliff Club. The template was still being written, and Merle was sitting in these rooms absorbing it, without quite realizing he was watching history being assembled in real time. Then came a series of decisions that were bad in the precise compounding way that tends to define a certain kind of young man's early 20s. Petty theft, a drunk and disorderly, a jail stint in Bakersfield, a failed escape attempt from that jail. He literally sawed through the bars, which at least demonstrated initiative, and finally, in December 1957, an attempted robbery of a Bakersfield roadhouse called the Cain's Tavern. Merle was 20 years old. He thought the bar was closed. It was not closed. The owner was inside. Merle was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 2 to 15 years in California State Prison at San Quentin. He arrived at San Quentin in January 1958. 3 days later, Johnny Cash played a concert in the mess hall. The Cash concert at San Quentin on January 1, 1958, lasted roughly an hour. Merle Haggard spent the rest of his sentence. He was paroled in November 1960 after serving just under 3 years, thinking about what he had witnessed. Not Cash specifically, though Cash was a revelation. What he had witnessed was the specific mechanism of it. A man standing in front of 1,200 people who had nothing, offering them the one thing a prison cannot confiscate, which is the feeling of being understood by a stranger. Haggard filed that observation away with the carefulness of someone who plans to use it later. He was released in November 1960 with a felony record, no money, and an uncommon clarity of purpose. He went back to Bakersfield. He got day work, digging ditches and picking cotton, and at night he played any club that would have him. He married Leona Hobbs, his first wife, the first of 5, and continued the dual schedule of manual labor and music that would define the next 3 years of his life. Buck Owens was starting to break nationally out of Bakersfield by this point, and the infrastructure was building. Labels were paying attention, producers were circling, and the raw electric sound of the valley was starting to travel. In 1962, Merle walked into a recording session for Tally Records, a small Bakersfield label run by Fuzzy Owen and Louis Tally. Owen would become, by any measure, the most important non-musical figure of Haggard's early career, a practical, meticulous man who understood how to position an artist without neutering what made the artist interesting. Merle recorded Skid Row for Tally that year. It didn't set the world on fire. What it did was demonstrate that Haggard in a studio sounded exactly like Haggard on a bar stool, which was rarer than it should have been. The breakthrough came in 1963 with All My Friends Are Gonna Be Strangers, which climbed to number 10 on the Billboard country charts. Capitol Records noticed. They offered a deal. Haggard signed. And here is where the standard narrative of the country music industry applied itself to Merle Haggard with perfect predictability. Capitol owned the publishing on his early recordings, structured the royalties in the way labels structured royalties in 1965, and essentially ensured that the man doing the work would see a fraction of the money his work generated. Standard operating procedure. Not much of a partnership, all things considered. But the records moved. I'm a Lonesome Fugitive hit #1 in January 1967. Branded Man hit #1 in August 1967. Sing Me Back Home hit #1 in December 1967. 3 #1 singles in a single calendar year, and Merle Haggard was still technically on probation. The parole board had been informed of his music career. They were watching. What none of them, not the label, not the parole board, not the critics who were starting to write seriously about him, had figured out yet, was that Haggard was about to record a song that would change the entire conversation about what country music was supposed to say and who it was supposed to speak for. And that song would make him the most controversial figure in American popular music for a period of roughly 3 years, which, given the competition in 1969, was not a small achievement. Okie from Muskogee was recorded in October 1969 and released in November of that year. The song describes a town that doesn't smoke marijuana, burn draft cards, or let its hair grow long. A town that, in other words, was not participating in the counterculture movement that was occupying roughly half of America's cultural bandwidth in 1969. Haggard claimed in later interviews that the song was partly satirical, that he was playing a character, that he was exploring a point of view. I was writing a character song, he told journalist Peter Guralnick in 1980. I was playing a part. The other half of the country heard it as a sincere statement of values and made it #1 for 4 weeks. Both halves were angry at each other, and Merle Haggard specifically became the object of that anger in the way that artists do when their work becomes a symbol before they've had a chance to explain what they meant by it. And honestly, the ambiguity was at least partly Merle's own construction. He knew what Okie from Muskogee would sound like to the people who needed it to sound that way. He made that choice. It was extremely successful. The results were complicated. The follow-up single, The Fight Inside of Me, came in early 1970 and was less ambiguous. Richard Nixon cited both songs approvingly. The veterans of foreign wars named Merle Haggard their Person of the Year. The counterculture press decided he was a reactionary. He played the White House. He continued to have #1 records. He was, by any commercial measure, at the absolute peak of his career, selling out shows, landing on magazine covers, and being interviewed by people who wanted to understand him as a cultural phenomenon rather than as a musician. This is a particular kind of success that tends to create a specific kind of problem. The world stops listening to what you're actually saying and starts using you as a prop in an argument you didn't quite start. Meanwhile, his personal life was moving at the speed and direction of a car with bad brakes on a grade. His marriage to Leona had ended in divorce in 1964. He had married Bonnie Owens, Buck Owens' ex-wife, which is the kind of detail that makes Bakersfield sound like a very small town. Because in the ways that mattered, it was in 1965. Bonnie was pragmatic, professionally useful, and genuinely important to Merle's early career success. She toured with him, sang backup, and provided a stability that he was constitutionally incapable of providing for himself. She was the rock of that operation, said Fuzzy Owen in a 1994 interview with the Los Angeles Times. Without Bonnie, I don't know if any of us would have survived those years. The drinking had been present since the honky-tonk years. By the early 1970s, it was structural, not a personal flaw but an operating condition, the thing that allowed a man with Haggard's emotional composition to get through the specific requirements of touring, recording, and being a public symbol for competing sets of people who all felt they owned a piece of him. The road band, the Strangers, had long since learned to read the difference between the versions of Merle that arrived at different shows. This realization, that the thing keeping the operation running might also be the thing that would eventually bring it down, was available to anyone who looked carefully. Not many people were looking carefully. They were too busy buying the records. And somewhere inside all of this, there was still the matter of the felony. California had not pardoned Merle Haggard. He was a convicted felon, which meant restrictions on where he could travel, what he could legally do, and how he was treated by certain segments of a country music industry that, despite its own complicated relationship with outlaws, remained formally uncomfortable with actual ones. That problem had a possible solution, and it would come from a direction that nobody, including Merle, had entirely anticipated. The pardon came on January 18, 1972. Governor Ronald Reagan signed it personally, restoring Merle Haggard's full civil rights. It was, by any practical measure, exactly the outcome that Merle's situation required, and Reagan cited both the quality of Haggard's rehabilitation and his contribution to American culture as grounds for the decision. The formal language of a governor's pardon is not known for its warmth, but this one was as warm as that language gets. What Reagan did not know, or if he knew, chose not to mention, was that the man whose rehabilitation he was formally recognizing had, at the time of signing, a fairly well-documented drug and alcohol problem that was available to anyone on his tour bus. Not a rumor, a documented condition. The pardon, in other words, arrived at the precise moment when Merle Haggard's personal circumstances were at their most complicated. He was sober enough to accept it, which was the relevant thing, but the larger situation was not improving. That detail did not make the press. The divorce from Bonnie Owens came in 1978. They remained professionally connected. Bonnie continued singing backup with the Strangers for years, which is a specific kind of complicated that most people wisely avoid. But the marriage was over. Merle had been involved with Leona Williams, one of his backup singers, for some time before the divorce was final. He married Leona in 1978. That marriage would also end in divorce in 1983 and produce enough material for a small country music soap opera, most of which Merle subsequently recorded and released as an album, because that's the kind of move that either signals confidence or a complete absence of self-preservation instinct. Possibly both. I probably shouldn't have married as many times as I did, Haggard admitted to biographer David Cantwell in an interview compiled for his 2013 biography, Merle Haggard, The Running Kind. But I also probably shouldn't have done a lot of things I did. Didn't stop me. The drinking and drug use moved from background condition to foreground problem somewhere in the late 1970s. The specific substance that compounded things was cocaine, which arrived in the touring circuit in the mid-1970s and settled in like a business partner nobody had explicitly invited. Merle's relationship with it was functional for a period, and then not functional, in the familiar sequence. The Strangers, a band that had been with him long enough to have developed opinions, watched and waited. Fuzzy Owen watched and waited. The records kept coming. Haggard was still capable of extraordinary work in the studio, regardless of what was happening outside it, which is the most dangerous kind of professional resilience because it provides cover for everything else. In 1983, Capitol dropped him. After 18 years and 38 #1 singles, the label decided that Merle Haggard's commercial moment had passed. He signed with Epic Records. The commercial moment had not entirely passed. He would continue to chart, but the infrastructure of his career had shifted, and with it went some of the protective insulation that major label support provides. He was now navigating the business more directly, with fewer buffers between his personal condition and its professional consequences. This was not, as it turned out, ideal timing. What nobody said out loud in any of the trade coverage of the Capitol departure was that the man who had built one of the most consistent chart records in country music history was also a man in serious need of a different kind of help than a new record deal. Everybody could see it. Nobody said it. And the records kept coming. On April 6, 2016, his 79th birthday, Merle Haggard died at his ranch in Palo Cedro, Shasta County, California. The cause was double pneumonia, complicated by a lung infection that he had been treating with varying degrees of commitment for several months. He had canceled and rescheduled a number of concert dates in the preceding weeks. His wife, Teresa Ann Lane, his fifth wife, whom he had married in 1993, was with him. His children from various marriages were there, or reached by phone. It was, by the standards of country music deaths, relatively straightforward. A man in his late 70s with a history of lung problems died of lung disease. The birthday coincidence was the kind of thing that gets noted in every obituary and doesn't mean anything, but feels like it should. What was less straightforward was the 3-month stretch leading up to it. Haggard had been visibly unwell since at least January 2016, when he was photographed at events looking considerably diminished from his usual self. People around him knew. His touring schedule knew the cancellations were not kept quiet. He kept saying he wanted to get back out there. Guitarist Norm Hamlet, who had been playing with the Strangers since 1966, told the Associated Press the day after Haggard's death. That was Merle. He didn't know how to stop. He did not, in the strictest sense, stop. He recorded in January 2016 at his home studio, a studio he had built on his ranch specifically so he would never have to be anywhere else to make music, and the recordings were released posthumously. This is the detail that lands differently the more you think about it. A man who knew he was dying, who was too ill to reliably get through a concert, still went into the studio and recorded because the alternative was not recording, which was apparently not a viable option. Whatever you think of Okie from Muskogee or any of the cultural arguments that surrounded it, that specific fact says something about what music actually was to Merle Haggard that no biography quite captures. The lung cancer diagnosis had come earlier, in 1995, when a tumor was removed from his left lung. He quit smoking after the surgery, and the cancer did not return. But the lung damage was structural and cumulative, and by his mid-70s, it was the primary limiting factor on what he could physically do. He was aware of this. He had been candid in interviews about the breathing difficulties, about the oxygen he sometimes needed backstage. He continued to tour. He continued to record. He booked dates for 2016 that he knew were optimistic. In my opinion, this is either admirable or reckless, depending on how you feel about a man's right to make decisions about his own body, and possibly it is both simultaneously. The year 2016 had already been brutal for American music before April 6th. David Bowie had died in January. Glenn Frey had died in January. Prince would die in April, 16 days after Haggard. The obituary writers were running short on superlatives by the time they got to Merle, which is its own kind of absurdity, and not one anyone could have planned for. He was buried at his ranch. The funeral was private, per the family's wishes. The industry that had dropped him from Capitol in 1983 issued the customary statements. The musicians who had played with the Strangers for decades, some of them for 40 years, did not issue statements. They mostly went quiet, which is the more honest response. The numbers, when you line them up, are the kind of numbers that shouldn't require explanation, but always do, because the industry had a complicated relationship with Merle Haggard, even at the height of his commercial success. 38 #1 singles on the Billboard country charts. Multiple CMA awards, including Entertainer of the Year in 1970. Member of the Country Music Hall of Fame since 1994. His name on albums that are taught in musicology programs as case studies in how to deploy silence in a recording, how to phrase a lyric so that the word lands after the beat in a way that feels like inevitability rather than accident. Bob Dylan, in a 1985 interview with Bill Flanagan, said, "Merle Haggard is probably the greatest living American songwriter." Dylan said this while Haggard was still regularly moving units, still charting, still recording, which made it less an act of nostalgic tribute and more a simple professional assessment. The Bakersfield sound, which Haggard didn't invent but did more than anyone except Buck Owens to codify and sustain, became the direct antecedent of the outlaw country movement of the 1970s, which in turn became the antecedent of essentially everything in mainstream country that positioned itself against Nashville polish. You can draw a fairly direct line from Merle Haggard to Waylon Jennings to Steve Earle to every contemporary artist who describes their music as authentic in a press bio. Whether any of them would have chosen that word without Haggard having demonstrated what the thing actually sounded like is a reasonable question. What the Country Music Hall of Fame induction in 1994 represented, in practical terms, was the industry's formal acknowledgement that Haggard was important in ways that could no longer be productively ignored. He had been important for 30 years at that point. The acknowledgement arrived on the industry's schedule, as these things do, which is to say, significantly after the fact. The award looks considerably more impressive when you don't think too hard about the timeline. The Cash concert at San Quentin is now part of multiple histories simultaneously. It's in Cash's story as the moment that demonstrated his genuine connection to incarcerated audiences. It's in San Quentin's story as a cultural event. And it's in Merle Haggard's story as the origin point of a 50-year career, which means a single hour of live music in a prison mess hall in 1958 had consequences that are still audible today, which is either remarkable or just evidence that the right moment will find whoever happens to be standing in it. Merle Haggard spent his career insisting he was a simple man from a hard place. He was not a simple man. The hard place part was accurate. And that's Merle Haggard. A man who watched Johnny Cash play a concert in a prison, decided to become a musician as a direct result, and then proceeded to build one of the most consequential careers in country music history, which is the kind of origin story that would be rejected as too convenient if it were fiction. The fact that he also had a presidential pardon, 5 marriages, a #1 record the year he was still technically on parole, and a feud with the counterculture that he may or may not have intended seriously just makes the whole thing more interesting, not less. What I keep coming back to is the Cash concert. Not the pardon, not the chart records, not Okie from Muskogee. The concert. Because everything that followed that hour in San Quentin came from the same basic impulse. Merle Haggard watching someone hold a room full of people who had nothing and deciding that was the thing worth doing. If you've got a take on Okie from Muskogee, satire, sincerity, something else entirely, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. This one still gets argued about, and honestly, it should. Next time on Country Mysteries, Keith Whitley. The golden voice of a generation, a blood alcohol level that didn't make medical sense, and a death that nobody in Nashville wanted to talk about out loud. That one's coming. I'm Roman. Thanks for watching.